Hi, in this module, we're going to look at working with SharePoint Framework Extensions. And first in this section, we're going to look at introducing extensions and application customizers. What we're going to cover in this section are what SharePoint Framework Extensions are, what the debugging and testing of extensions looks like, how we deploy them, and then we're going to look at our first extension type called an application customizer. In SharePoint Framework Extensions are going to extend the SharePoint user experience, and they're going to allow us to do things like customizing notification areas, toolbars, and list data views. They're only available to us in the modern experience of pages, lists, and libraries, and that means we can only use them in SharePoint Online and in SharePoint Server 2019. And it's used to implement popular customizations from prior development models that we used to be able to do. So for example, we used to be able to do things like delegate controls and the script link control. Those are now being implemented using application customizers. We also had the ability to change how fields were rendered using JS Link and client-side rendering. That's now done using field customizers. And then we also had the ability to do things with buttons inside of menus, context menus for items, and toolbars in lists and libraries. And we call those custom actions or command sets. Now, what are application customizers? These are going to allow us to add script to any page, and they're also going to allow us to have access to the header and the footer sections on a page. We call these top and bottom. The field customizer, well, this is the customizing the rendering of a list column in a modern list. So you can see here the %complete column has got some custom rendering that I've defined using JavaScript as a custom field customizer. And the command set is the other kind of option. And this is where we can add a button to our list and library toolbars or to the context menu of items within a list. Now, let me talk a little bit about what the project structure looks like for a SharePoint Framework project that's using extensions. We've seen this before with web parts, and it's basically the exact same thing. The .vs code file or folder that's created in a project is going to contain VS Code specific files, things like for running with tasks, for debugging, and for doing different and for configuring settings. The config folder includes all of our configuration files. And that's going to be useful for not only bundling, but also for packaging up our deployment, sending it off to a custom CDN if we weren't using the Office 365 CDN, as well as configuring our startup process when we do development. The lib folder and the dist folder, these are created on the fly, as well as the temp folder, when we do builds and bundling of our projects. These are used to, we use these, or these are created to create the temp files that are created for the different build artifacts on their way to being packaged and deployed. The node modules folder contains all of our dependencies that our project needs. If you're a .NET developer, you may be familiar with the packages folder from a NuGet based project. Node modules is what we use in the node world. That's where we get all of our dependencies are coming from the node registry, and they're all installed here inside the node modules folder. The SharePoint folder is usually it's just dynamically generated when we create web parts. But in the case of an extension, it's also going to contain the assets that we need to deploy an extension. And we'll see that when we get to the deployment piece a little bit later. And then naturally the SRC folder or the source folder, that's the main folder for our project. It includes the extension, the styles, and a test file as well. Now let's talk for a minute about what the debugging and the testing of extensions looks like. Unlike web parts, extensions are going to require a live SharePoint site, list, and or a library. Now we can still build and host the extensions projects locally while we're testing in a remote SharePoint site. It's a similar experience that we use to using the hosted SharePoint Workbench for web part development, testing, and debugging. Now, one of the nice things is that the configurations have been added to each project by the SharePoint Framework Yeoman generator. That's going to help us in simplifying the loading of these different SharePoint sites. And they really are going to do three things. They're going to instruct the SharePoint page to load the SharePoint framework because that's not necessarily always loaded on every page. It's only going to be added to pages that need the SharePoint framework when there's a component on the page. It's also going to tell the SharePoint framework an additional location of a manifest file that it should go fetch. And that's used to tell the SharePoint framework about our customization that we create. This is going to trigger a dialog to pop up for us to make sure that we're okay with loading unsafe files. It's our unsafe file that we're loading, but it's just a warning to make sure that people aren't being hijacked or fooled into doing something they shouldn't be doing. And then the third thing that it does, I don't have it listed here, but the third thing that it will do is it will then tell the SharePoint framework what component from that manifest file should be added to the page and what any information about that component needs to be specified, like if it's what location should it be, what public property should it have, etc. Now, when it comes to deployment of an extension, the deployment is going to be very similar to web parts, but we're going to be using the existing SharePoint feature framework to get these different items provisioned into SharePoint. And under the covers, really, web parts are doing the same thing, but it's a little more transparent to you when it comes to web parts. So for an application customizer and a command set, we're using the existing custom action feature framework element type. That is going to have some additional properties on it to specify a custom script component. For a field customizer, the way that this is going to work is you're going to have to create a custom site column. You're going to do that declaratively using the field schema from the feature framework schema. And in that is when is also where you're going to specify the unique ID of the client-side component that you've created so that SharePoint knows what script file it should be loading to render it out. Some extensions that we look at here also support the notion of a tenant-wide deployment, which is another interesting characteristic that we have with the SharePoint framework. Tenant-wide deployment is going to allow us to have centralized control of which extensions are available across all site collections and sites for your entire tenant. Now, it's going to allow us to also enable or implement a consistent user experience across all of our sites and have a consistent deployment across all of our sites. And the other nice thing about it is that with an extension, usually it's not automatically added to a site. You would have to go install it onto a site when you wanted to use it. But if you use the tenant-wide deployment, it's automatic. This functionality is automatically going to be enabled on all newly created sites. Now, what this does is that this is going to bypass the need for installation of your extension on each site collection. It's supported for only application customizers and list view command sets. It's not supported for field customizers, and that's because that would end up creating a site column in every single site collection, which may not be what you're looking to do. It's also going to be made available for, you can also configure it so that it is only making this extension available for specific sites using a specific template, such as a team site or a hub site or a communication site, or for specific list templates in the case of command sets. And so, for example, if you just wanted a button to show up in a document library and not a list. You're also going to have the ability to specify the public properties on an extension across all the sites. And the way that this is going to be your default experience for extensions, and it's going to be the default because of the presence of a new file in the SharePoint assets folder called client-side instances.xml. That's going to be added to your SharePoint package. If you don't want tenant-wide deployment to be an option, you delete this file before deploying your project. Now, one thing to note about this is that with tenant-wide deployment, this is only going to work, it's only available if you are in SharePoint Online. It does not work in SharePoint Server 2019 on premises. So going back to the extensions, the way that this works is that there's a special list that's added to your tenant scoped app catalog. When you look at this list, there's a couple of different fields in it, and it's going to map to some of the things I just talked about a second ago. For example, the components properties, the list template, and the web template, those are all things that I just discussed just a minute ago. The component ID is the unique ID of the item, of the component ID from the project itself. And you'll find that in the manifest file for your project. The title property and is going to be used as just a friendly name for where you can define what this thing is. So like say, for example, if you would create an application customizer that added Azure Application Insights to every single page throughout your SharePoint tenant, this is going to allow you to give it a name, like saying this is the Contoso App Insights, when that may not be the actual name of it. The location is where this is going to go. So we have different supported locations for application customizers and list view command sets. And the sequence is if we have multiple extensions that we're deploying, what is the order that they should be rendered or added to the page? So we can have a little more control over it that way. Now let's talk a little bit more about application customizers. An application customizer is pretty simple here. What this is going to allow us to do is to add HTML or JavaScript to all pages within a SharePoint site. It's similar to like in prior to the SharePoint framework. It's similar to things called like delegate controls or script link controls, because what it's going to allow us to do is to add JavaScript to every single page on a site, and then there's going to be two elements or two HTML elements, two divs on the page, one at the top and one at the bottom, that we can get a handle on and inject HTML into them. So this type of an extension is useful in a couple different scenarios, such as adding script to every page, adding a third-party library to every page, like in the example I gave a minute ago, Azure Application Insights. Also, another option is to add a notice to all pages, such as a news or alert or a privacy notice. Now, these placeholders, what I just mentioned a second ago, this is another thing that we can take advantage of with an application customizer. There's two well-known placeholders that exist on every page, the header and the footer. The header is going to show up pinned just below the suite bar in Office 365, while the footer is going to be pinned against the bottom of the browser. Now, keep in mind that these are sticky, which means they're going to be persistent when you scroll the page, and they're always going to be visible. So here's a code snippet of what an application customizer looks like. Here at the top, I have our public properties that have been defined on it. So I just have one called, like, say, a prefix string. And then inside of this placeholder, it's extending the base application customizer class. And there's really only one method that's really interesting here, and that's the onInit method. This is where you're going to do all of your work. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that whenever you want to work with one of the placeholders, you should get a reference to it, or you should first check to see if you already have a reference to it. Because if you try and get two references to the same thing, it can cause issues. And so here I've created two placeholders, top and bottom. And what I'll do inside of the init is I'll try to get I'll check and see, do I have a reference to top? And if I don't, that's when I'll then try and get a reference to it. So this is best shown in a demo. So let's switch over to a demo and let's take a look at what an application customizer looks like. In this first demo, we're going to see how we can work with an application customizer in a SharePoint Framework extension. So here what I have is an application customizer that has taken a hold of the top placeholder and the bottom placeholder. And I've just simply written out some text to each one of these two different areas. Really straightforward and really simple. Now what I'd like to do is let's take a look at the code and how we did this. So if I come over here to the code and I look at the TypeScript file for my extension, what I'll see here is I have a property of header and footer that are being defined here. But if I scroll down a little bit further, we will find a section inside of the application customizer where I have a reference to the top and the bottom placeholder. Now, the reason why I'm getting these references as members, private members inside of my web part or inside of my extension is because you don't want to have multiple handles to the same placeholder provider. And the reason why is that if you do that, you're going to get an exception. So I'm keeping track of the fact of which one I have a handle on. And in this case here, I've got a reference to both top and bottom. So what I do is inside of the onInit method, I'm going to call a method here that's just saying that when the changed event happens for the placeholder provider, I'm going to call the this render placeholders. And that's where you see this listed right here. So now what I'm going to do first is I'm going to check to see, do I have a reference to the top placeholder? And if the answer is, if I do not have a reference to it, if it's no, then I'm going to try to get a reference to it and say, go try to get it by saying this.context.placeholderprovider.try create content. Try to get a reference to the top placeholder. And when you get that reference, assuming that you do, let's attach to the dispose method. Let's attach to my own dispose method that I've created. Now, my own dispose method doesn't do anything. It's right down here and it just simply says that it writes a message out to the console. But if I had any other handles on things like timers or outstanding network requests and stuff, that would be a good place where I would clean those up. So I'm going to do another check to verify, do you in fact have a reference to the top placeholder provider? And if you do, then you're in good shape. Continue. Otherwise, we're going to throw an error because clearly something's wrong. So now I'm going to check to see, are any properties defined? And if I did have a property that was defined, if I do have properties defined, then I will come down and grab the header property for that, for those properties. And in this case here, I'm checking to see if I did have a header message, then I'm going to use that. Otherwise, I'm going to set it to a default value of the header property was not defined. A little bit farther down, now I'm going to go actually right to that placeholder. So I'm going to check to see, do I have a reference to the div element on the page where the top placeholder is? And that's indicated by going to the top placeholder's DOM element property. And if I do, then I'm just going to write out some HTML. So I'm going to write out to the inner HTML property a div that contains a little icon here. And then after that icon, I'm going to write out the header message. So how is this getting displayed on the page? Or how am I getting this to show up on the page? Well, one of the things I did ahead of time was I came over here to my serve.json and I'm setting the page URL equal to a valid SharePoint Online page. You can see here on the page URL for the other serve configuration, it's pointing to Contoso. And Contoso is not a valid site. So what I did is I went ahead and I used a valid site that I could use for my testing. Then we can see the additional information about this is a custom action that's going to get added. This GUID right here is the GUID from the components manifest. So if I come down here to the manifest file for my extension, you can see that it ends in 7537 right here at the top. If I come back over here to my serve.json, we can see it's 7537. It is an application customizer, and then we're defining our properties. So you can see one property is the header area of the page and the footer area of the page. And if you recall from the demo, it had the header area of the page and the footer area of the page were both displayed here. So that's all there is in working with a application placeholder. There is another one that I didn't show you a little bit farther down for the bottom placeholder, but the code for it is the exact same as the top placeholder. And so that's how we can work with application placeholders in SharePoint Framework Extensions. Now in the second section, let's take a look at another kind of an extension called a field customizer. Now, in this section, we're going to just do a quick little overview on what extensions are. We're going to talk about, or what the field customizer extension is. We're going to look at the debugging and the testing story for it, and then we're going to look at the deployment story for it as well. So a field customizer is going to allow us to customize the rendering of a cell in a list view display mode. It's similar to the pre-SharePoint Framework or classic mode customizations that you're familiar with of client-side rendering and JS Link. And some really common scenarios for it is displaying a picture or an illustration in a field instead of just simple text. Maybe you also want to make a field rendering a little more interactive. And maybe you even want to have a React component be responsible for rendering out your field. So here's what the class looks like for this. What this is you're going to have, again, you'll have your properties at the top as you see there, and then we'll have our field customizer that extends the base field customizer class. Now there are a couple different events here. You have your on init, just like you had with your application customizer. But the one method that's interesting here where you'll do most of your work is the on render cell. And what this is, you're going to, inside of this, you'll be able to say event, and you'll be able to reference the this.dom element, just like you do with a web part. And that's going to point to the div where the cell is currently being rendered. So you can then write anything you want inside of that div. So you have full control over how all of that stuff works. Now, when it comes to the deployment of a field customizer as a site column, or as a deployment of a field customizer, you're going to do that as a site column. And this is going to look familiar to those of you who are used to the feature framework, specifically the field schema. The part here that is different for a field customizer are the last two properties, the client-side component ID and the client-side component properties. The component ID is the GUID of the field customizer from his manifest file in the project. We'll see that in the demo in a minute. And then the other part here is of the component properties. This is a HTML encoded string of the JSON string that's going to of the object of the public properties on my item. So here you can see there is a property here called the green min limit that is set to, it looks like 85%, and then the yellow min limit is set to 70. And you can see here that I had to put in these quotes that have been escaped, these HTML escaped. And then you can see the colon there as well. So like yellow min limit is quoted, and then colon, and then 70 is also quoted inside of this JSON object. Now, unlike web parts, extensions are going to require us to run these in a live SharePoint list and or library. Now you can still build and host the extension project locally, just like an app customizer, while you're testing it in a remote SharePoint site. And again, just like the app customizer, it's very similar to a web part. Microsoft has even created some configurations for each project that we'll see in the demo in a minute. It's done that using the Yeoman generator that's going to simplify loading this on our SharePoint sites. Now, when you want to test how this thing works, you're going to have to specify the internal name of the field, of an existing field that you want to associate the field customizer with. So when you deploy it, you're going to actually create a site column, and you're going to tell that site column, use this field customizer for your rendering. But in development, you don't have to create the site column ahead of time. You can just say, I want to use an existing column and I want to test it. And so this is going to let SharePoint kind of rewire the experience just while you're testing it. But again, on the deployment pieces I showed you a minute ago, you're going to be using the feature framework, and it's going to be provisioned as a new site column using the field element. And then we've already gone through these other pieces too, what the client-side component ID is, the client-side component properties is, and how you're going to use those. So let's take a look at this. It's easier to see a working example and understand how these field customizers work if we can see a running example. So let's take a look at that. In this second demo, we're going to look at a field customizer. And in this case, you can see one that I've already created under the %complete column. What this is doing is this is showing me some information, but it's rendering it out in a custom way. So if I actually come over here to this work status page, and let's just go grab the link for this page and go to a brand new browser. You can see here that the value inside of this list, they just have numbers of 95, 80, and 50. But when we looked at it, we can see here that we actually have real rendering showing up here. It's a little bit nicer to read, so it shows a little bit more of an indication of what's going on. So how does this work? Well, one of the things I've done is if I come over here to my, my code, and I open up the field customizer, what you'll see is I've got two public properties that are defined on this. I've got a green limit and a yellow limit. Those are minimum limits. So if I scroll down here and we take a look at the on render cell, I'm first going to go get a reference or add a CSS style, some styles to the cell. So you see I have the styles.cell. I'm adding in a list of classes to that cell. So I've gone ahead, and if I back up here, you can see that I've created a cell here of an inline block, and then I've got like a filled background that I'm going to specify right here that's just all gray. So if I come back over here to my code, that here I've gone through and I've added in that background for the cell. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to determine what color and text that I want to use. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the event that's being passed in. So this onRender cell is going to happen for every single one of those cells. And the event object that's being passed in, or the event parameter, is details about the thing that is the subject that is triggering this event. I'm going to look at the field value. So that's going to give me either a 95 or an 80 or whatever. And then this check right here, what this is going to do is this is going to figure out what color should be used to display. So here in this case, I'm going to check to see, is it not a number, or is the number equal to 0? And if that's the case, then I'm just going to write out there's been no progress. And we saw that in the browser. We can see that there was no progress on this one. But when there is progress, so under the else statement, I'm going to look at the value that's being passed in and check to see, is the number greater than or equal to the green limit? And if it is, we're going to use green as the background color. Otherwise, if it's yellow, we're going to use yellow as a background color. And if it's below that minimum limit, then it's not good. So we're going to consider that red. So I'm going to create the red color right here. And then every event that's being passed in for that cell, the way I'm going to deal with the value coming from or the rendering that I want to use for that field customizer is the DOM element is going to point to the div of an item of that column in the list for that specific list item. So I'm going to use DOM element and then say enter HTML, and I'm going to write out the styles %complete. So that style right here is the %complete, and inside of that I'll specify a filled background. That filled background that you see here, that style is give me a background color for that entire cell that's 100 pixels wide, equal to the color of gray. And that's how I'm getting that little shaded gray. If you can see that in the video here, you can see I've got like shaded gray on the background. And then I'm going to write out in the code here, I'm going to write out another div, and the width of that is going to be equal to the percentage, which is just a set of pixels, but I'm just going to be using a number from 1 to 100, or from 0 to 100, I guess. And I'll set the background color equal to this, and the text color will be black. And then I'm simply going to write out the value of this text to say non-breaking space, followed by the actual % completed. And that's how we build a custom field control, or custom field customizer. Now, how do we get this to run and see in development mode? Well, what I have to do is inside the serve JSON, I have to create a configuration that'll load this and to get this guy to work. So like the other extensions, I had to change the URL to be a page that will support these app customizers or support these field customizers. And I did that by pointing to my work status page. Now, it's a field customizer, and so what I have to do is the value that you see listed here on number 9, this initially would say the internal field name, but I had to change that to be the name of the field where I wanted this to show up. And I knew that that was called the % complete with no spaces in it. All right, so I said % complete, the ID is the ID of the component, which came from this manifest, and then I'm setting these two properties that I wanted to define when this gets added to the page. And so when this runs, it's going to go to this page and it's going to say replace the % complete field with this field customizer, and the field customizer is that ID with these values. If I was going to deploy this to production, if I come over here and look at the elements XML, you can see here that I'm creating a new site column that's going to be using this component as it's rendering. We've got our green limit, we've got our yellow limit farther off the screen there. And the name of this field is going to be called the SPFX %. It doesn't matter that this doesn't match my testing thing, because this, or my testing experience you saw a moment ago, because this is what's going to happen in production. This is just simply giving me a way to see it in the local developer experience. And so that's how we can create and test a custom field customizer using a SharePoint Framework extension. In this last section, we're going to look at the third extension type, which is a list view command set. And so we're going to do the same thing we did a second ago, which is we're going to do an overview of what these are, look at the debugging and the testing side of this, and then look at what the deployment aspects are for each one of these things. A list view command set is going to allow us to add a button to a modern list in library. We can either do it to the toolbar, as you see there in that screenshot showing command 1 and command 2, or we can do it to the context menu on an item. You can't see that in the picture, but it's there. Or you can do both. You're going to also have the ability to control the visibility state of a button based on the state of the current view. And it's going to be similar to the pre-SharePoint Framework classic mode customizations that you may be familiar with of custom actions. Some example scenarios for this: you'll be able to start an external process or execute some custom logic when these buttons are clicked. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing you're going to have to do is go into the manifest of your component, and you're going to have to define the buttons inside of a new items object. So here I've got 2 buttons defined. I've got one item selected and always on. Take note that the IDs of your buttons should be in all caps, should be all alpha, all letters, no numbers. And if you need to separate words, use the underscore. You can run into issues if you deviate from that and use lowercase or numbers or something other than an underscore. So it's just letters and underscores, and they all must be uppercase is the general rule here. The icon image URL, that should be a fully qualified URL to where the image is located if you want to use an image in your button. And then you're going to go work on the code for it. Now the code for this, like the other ones, we have some public properties we can define in an interface that you see at the top. And then we have a class that's going to extend the base list view command set class. Now you've got 3 different methods that you're going to be interested in working with here. The onInit is great for initialization stuff. Then you have the onListViewUpdated. And what this is this is going to be fired every single time you the state of your view of the list that you're currently on, every time the state changes. So like, for example, if you select an item, or you unselect an item, or you filter, or you sort, anytime that happens, this is going to get called. It's going to allow you to either to do some logic. And one of the most common things you would do in here is using the event object. You would be able to set the visibility property to true or false, so you can show and hide the button. And that's what our demo is going to do. We're going to show you how to hide the button based on how many items are selected. And then when someone clicks the button, that's going to fire the onExecute button. So you're going to need to determine which button was clicked, and then from there you can figure out on which item it was clicked, or how many of all the items that were clicked, and stuff like that. So you have full control over those things. Debugging and testing of command sets is identical to the other extensions, with the exception that we have to do this inside of a live SharePoint list or library. I mean, it's similar to what a field customizer did. And the reason for that is because we have to have a list to be able to test our button. So it's going to be added to an existing list. The deployment, the way that this is going to work, is it's going to be deployed the same way that we used to deploy custom actions. We're going to use the custom action element, but we're also going to have 2 additional properties, as you saw earlier, for the component ID and the component properties. In addition, we can also leverage tenant-wide deployment in these as well. This is going to allow us to deploy our command set across all sites throughout our entire site collection if we wanted to. And we've already gone through these points as well, where you have the way that this works is with a custom list or a special list that lives in the tenant scoped app catalog in your tenant app catalog. And if there's an instance of that list item in here, this is where you'd be able to, this is what's going to tell SharePoint to deploy it everywhere across SharePoint. So again, like the other ones, the best way to see how this works is with a working demo. So let's switch over to a demo and let's see one of these. In this last demo in this module, I want to show you how we can work with custom command sets, which is going to allow us to have buttons on the toolbar or in the context menu of an item that you see down here. Now up here you can see that I have my button up here of always on. This is my custom button, and when I click on it I can see a little prefix of string that will show up, and then it's showing me how many items are selected. You also can conditionally show buttons and setting their visibility, and you're going to be able to do that by counting the number of items, or by some other condition. You can set the different conditions on when this thing should or should not show, and you can do that all with your custom logic. Now in my case, what I've done is I've created it so that my always on button will always show. If I select one item, I have a one item that will show, and if I select two items, then one item goes away and two items will show. So let's see how this works. One thing to notice too is that you'll notice that, let's grab item number C. If I click this, you can see that I'm actually getting the text for item C showing up here for his title. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to come back over here to my code, and let's first, inside of a SharePoint Framework extension, I'm going to look at the manifest file. That's the first thing we should look at, because this one's a little bit different than the other extensions. This one here, I have to define the different buttons that I want to be able to use in my component here, in my custom command set. So here I've got one called one item selected, one is two items selected, and one is always on, and they each have titles in them. So if I come back over here to the code, what we'll see with this, and I scroll down, there's two methods of interest. There's the on list view updated, and there's the on execute. Now, the on list view updated is going to fire for every single one of my buttons that I've added to the list toolbar or to the context menu. And when it runs, I can do a check to see which one we're currently on, and I can check to see and do any other conditional stuff that I want to do. So in this case, one time it's going to run, this method will always fire whenever there is a view state change to the list. So is an item selected? Is the sorting change? Is there a filtering applied? Stuff like that. And so here what I'm doing is I'm checking to see, go get a reference to the one item button here. And I'm doing that by saying this.try get the command and giving it this ID. Then what I'm doing down here is I'm checking to say, if one item was selected, then set his visibility state equal to this value. So I'm checking to see how many items are selected. If only one item is selected, then this should be visible. Otherwise, make it hidden. For the two items, I'm doing the exact same thing, except this time I'm checking to see if there's two items selected. So that's how the one item and two item are both appearing and disappearing on the page. Then what happens when I select one of these things? Well, that's the on execute method. That's going to fire whenever an item is clicked. And so you can see here when one item is clicked, I'm writing out a dialog message, and that dialog message is going to write a little prefix out with our little sample string that we had. And then I'm going to say that one item was selected, and notice that I can say, use the event that's passed in, say dot selected rows, get the first item that was selected, because we only have one item selected in this case, and I'm going to say then get the value by the name and show the title field. So this is going to show me the value of the title field from the selected rows. All right, it's pretty cool, and it's pretty easy to implement one of these. Now, one thing to take note of: how do I control where these are going to show up? So you can see here in my serve configuration, in the location piece when I'm doing development, I can specify that I want this to be a list view command set in the command bar. If I change this from command bar to command menu, it would show up in the context menu for an item, and I left it out of both of them. It would show up everywhere in both examples. It would show up on the toolbar, and it would show up in the toolbar and in the context menu. Now, when I go to deploy this to production, if I look at custom elements XML, you can see that that is where I'm going to specify where I want this button to appear. Now in this case, I have 3 buttons in this project, so that means all of them are going to go on the command bar, none of them are going to go in the command menu. If I wanted to change that, I'd have to create different command sets. Each set could specify if it wanted to go in the command bar or if it wanted to go into the command set. So that's how I'm able to control where these different buttons are going to go. And that's it. That's how everything we need to see how to deploy these to a SharePoint to create our own custom buttons in the toolbars and in the ribbons or in the context menus for our SharePoint sites. And so with that, we looked at a bunch of different things here with extensions. We looked at what extensions were, generally how they work and where they're available. And then we looked at each one of the extensions in depth. We got to see application customizers, we got to see command sets and field customizers, both the development, the debugging, and the deployment story for each one of these. Now I've added in a bunch of references here on where you can learn more about extensions. So please take a minute to take a look at these different resources here. And I hope that you were able to get something out of this session and learn how you can customize and extend your SharePoint experience using SharePoint Framework extensions.